Hi guys, it's Vertis here. In this video, I'll be answering questions on Discord. So we've got lots to go through in terms of how we make a mouth bag for game characters. We'll also be touching a little bit on ornamental design, so how to manage that in terms of subdivisions and low polys. Then we'll be getting a little bit more technical in terms of eyelids and how characters animate their blinking, for example. Then we'll be delving into LODs and how they're going to be managed, looking into the future and different systems for that. Character nails, whether they're going to be separate or on the same sort of mesh. Then finally finishing off talking about optimized workflows and what people are currently using, which might potentially be outdated for the next wave of game technology. If you'd like to get your questions answered, then you can post a question in the monthly questions forum. We also have a work in progress forum. I'll be extracting people's projects from here and giving them video feedback for next week. So make sure you get all your characters in there. For those who don't know me, I'm Vertis. I've been a character artist for over a decade in the games industry. For a similar amount of time, I've also been an art director, so hiring teams of the top talent and also teaching game art at university. So if you've ever been confused about making characters or workflows that I use currently in games technology, then this is definitely the right place to be in terms of questions. So the first question comes from Marishub, and he's asking about the mouth bag for game characters. So what's the optimal way for opening the mouth, and especially when it comes to baking? So it's actually a really good question. You're thinking about the right things because as a character artist, you're not just creating sculpts and then baking it. They actually have to move, they have to animate, we have to open their mouths, for example. So this is an example of a character with a mouth open from Timu. So you can come in here and like this artist. And even to the greatest extent of having a mouth open, you can see that you can't actually see too far inside. So we don't focus too much on putting detail and sculpts inside of that. Unless it's like a werewolf creature will often do it. Often the mouth bag will actually be shared across multiple projects. So we just capture a mouth box, we often call it, or a mouth cavity, and then use it on multiple characters. So I'll show you that on a live project and also how you can match that with baking and also opening up your sculpt because it can be a little bit complicated. So the first fundamental how we approach it in a game, you might have a sculpt, for example, and in the industry we tend to have like a base mesh that already has a mouth cavity, but it's always a good idea to know how to actually model that in. So when we're creating a character, there'll be two states. There'll be where the mouth is closed and then the mouth is opened. So usually that's captured on a layer inside of ZBrush. So you can record the layer and then manually open up the jaw with move functionality and things like masks. So I've actually already done a video that's coming out showing you how to do every single step of that. So keep an eye out for that. But just as an example, we can open and close the mouth. So it's always funny as a character artist, you have to just accept that it's going to be in this weird mid zone where you can see the sculpted teeth, but it's going to be the animator's job to make this look good, as long as the topology is there for it to move about. So as a character artist, you'd basically have these two states. So that obviously adds another layer of complexity because we have to actually bake this mesh. But if we were going to bake this with the mouth closed, we'd obviously get something called overcasting, where it's going to the top lip's going to collect the bottom lip and vice versa, and then they're just going to be artifacts. So ideally, we want to first, when we are baking, to your question, is to export the weird mouth open version. Doesn't have to look good, it just has to be spaced out enough to collect all that baked information. But a trick and a technique that I suggest you use is after you've actually completed the bake, and I'll open this up in Substance Painter so you can see how it's done. We basically re-import the mesh that we want to see and we want to bake on. And because we're not rebaking it, we don't have to worry about that mouth open version. So basically what that leaves you with is we have one baked mesh. So it's collecting all the albedo, all the ambient occlusion, the curvature map. So that would be a character with the mouth open. You would export that as a low poly. So that comes into Substance Painter, and then we bake down all the information. So once the bake is complete and you've got no artifacts and everything's looking clean, then we come back to Substance Settings, and then we get the painted version, which is going to be either posed, it's going to be T-posed, or with its mouth closed, or the character that we want to do for the final review. And this is just a very, very simple re-import. So you re-import it, And basically all the textures and all the maps that you've done, because they share the same UVs, the UVs aren't moving, everything transfers nicely to this sculpt. So here it is inside of Substance. Obviously, if we were texturing loss on this, we actually can't see the inside of the mouth, so it's next to impossible. Very similar to what you expect with, in the olden days, we would explode a mesh, so it's all separated into individual pieces. Say you've got like a mech warrior or something, it would be all exploded into separate areas. So, for example, if you're texturing like a vehicle, for example, sometimes it's nice to separate them so other components aren't blocking other components and then you can just paint each one individually. So, that's more common for hard surface and props artists. You can do it for characters. Unfortunately, there's a lot of old information out there. So, people are making it on YouTube to explode a character mesh. We don't do that anymore because we have local ambient occlusion, which is very useful for characters. But you can quite as easily import something like this into Substance Painter, texture it, and then re-import the version that's all collected together, and all the textures will stay the same. And in fact, you can hop back and forth. You can import this crazy exploded version, texture it, and then re-import it and see what the preview is. You also asked what the optimal way of doing it. Now, I suspect if you've already got your Substance or your ZBrush file, what I like to do is, instead of sculpting an actual cavity, is create it in a 3D package, because it's far, far easier. And we can use things like wireframes to see inside of the character head and then use bridging. So here's a preview of the video. For those who are used to seeing their retopology of a character, we go through this entire process. So in ZBrush, we can basically isolate part of the mouth with normal hide and show features, and then export that into something like Maya. And then approaching it from the back, we basically create a very simple primitive and then try and line up the vertices and the edges to match. And that'll be done by a simple bridging process like here. So it's exactly the same. I get questions about the inside of a nose or the back of an eye. It's exactly the same sort of workflow. But that video's on its way, so it's good timing for that. So Drunken Meat had a question about the workflows for implementing ornaments. So potentially you might be doing armor or like a fireplace. So I often see a lot of alphas out there for that. So the question was mixing up the texturing stage and the high poly, how those basically interact, and how to deal with polygon density, especially when it comes to subdividing endlessly inside of ZBrush. So, and also if you can be using specific alphas and just good practice in general when approaching ornaments. So yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, there's so much detail within an ornament. If you were doing it, it would take you ages to sculpt and model those all individually. I think the tricky part to get around is a lot of people fall into the traps of downloading these really generic ornaments and packages, and then it just doesn't fit on their character. So I always suggest actually sculpting them from scratch, especially if it's a portfolio or an important piece. Like, all that's going to have is unique language that's very specific to your character. If you download something like this, which is meant for a fireplace, it's not going to look very good on your armor. So, to help you on your way and guide you in the right direction, you'll see a lot of different workflows. So, this, for example, is actually creating the individual ornament in a 3D package and then subdividing it. So, on your question, you would have a lot of geometry there, and I wouldn't really suggest it. And the effect doesn't come off that well. So this person's creating models in order to create an alpha, which they then put on armor, and you can see that the effect isn't that good. I always prefer to actually sculpt it and even potentially use a low poly for that, because we've got loads of texture budget nowadays and we can afford it. So yeah, in general, just look at all these alphas and you'll see the outcomes aren't very good. They don't really fit onto the surface of that armor. So I'll actually show you how to make these inside of ZBrush. I'll show you a couple of like quick tricks that I like to do when creating ornaments. So I usually start on a flat surface and then use the curve tubes. It's going to be really useful. And you might have a design that you're copying. So from here, you can basically draw your curves and decide on the thickness of it. And at this stage, it's basically constructing how the asset is going to be formed together. So sometimes you might have pieces that flow away to the side and curl around. I won't be accurate here. I'm just trying to focus on the techniques that you can use. So I just lay these out and copying your reference. You can draw these. Once you've done that, I would get a move topological. don't bother changing the curves because the curves can be very finicky. Basically, from here, you can start to design and open up the curvature or fix, for example, when it comes to dynameshing these all together, they're going to be flowing in and out of each other. So instead of sculpting straight on top of it, that can sometimes be messy, what I prefer to do is change the mask to something like a mask lasso. And then you can select an internal edge like this, for example. Obviously, it might be an idea to separate the back plate. So you can control shift click that off, control click to mask it, and then split it off. So say with more divisions here, I've masked the inside. I can invert it by control clicking off to the side. And then again, I would just use move tools to create different sort of incurves. So if you flip it, we can move this one in and then it's a bit more concave. So this is actually just how it's designed with woodwork and metal. Or you could get something like a standard brush and then go on the inside. I'm going very quickly, but you would want to change your brush settings so it's a lot smoother. And then you can obviously invert it again, change the draw size, maybe increase the bevel and the sharpness, and then smooth it all over. So you'd go across the entire mesh and do that. Then obviously, if you want a more rounded edge, you can come to inflate and then just start to inflate that and make it rounded. So I don't want to get carried away into sculpting this because we won't get through all the questions. But after here, you can basically use something like H polish and then just clean up all those edges. And that won't take you too long and it'll be very specific to how you want to do it. Now, on your question of sort of controlling how much geometry, like imagine you had this across the entire character, you could get into hundreds of millions. So basically good management of Z remeshing. So once you're happy with the overall design, Z remesh it so you've got the lowest subdivision version and then polish it at the higher subdivision. So subdivisions in ZBrush are pretty efficient because it's just simple quadded squared math. So whenever you're moving, it goes down to the lowest subdivision and then that should be okay. When it comes to your high poly bake, suggest sort of decimating it and then taking it out. So hopefully that shouldn't be too much of an issue. You can also reuse a couple of those elements. So say, for example, you work on the inner curve here, we can then duplicate that and then just move it in particular ways. I'll probably make an additional video on that because I can already think of about 5 more different techniques that we can use to like really make these cool. But as a basic overarching workflow, that's how we'd approach it. So the next question is from Andrew V3D. So he was asking a question about the eyelids for games characters and also how they're animated, for example, when we're blinking or closing the eyes. So it's a really interesting one because on the internet, you probably can't find any sort of information about this. It's only until you're in the industry and you actually work with an animator on. There's an interesting story behind this when people are sort of applying and contractors are applying for character art gigs and you want to test their knowledge. And if they have worked in the games industry, I've asked them before, how do you think we would approach, for example, like closing an eye or blinking? And sometimes they get caught out and try and come up with these really advanced, inventive ways of doing it with sort of like a mixture of blend spaces or even some programming in some sort of cases. But the simplest solution is usually the best. So when it comes to blinking inside of games, try and think of a character where you've actually seen that happen. Even in a cinematic, we don't often see it that closely. The only place it is really important is if you have a character that's sleeping or they do have really big eyes. So for animated and feature films, for example, we do need a lot of geometry around the eye area. But when it comes to realistic characters, obviously because the eyelid is so small, it can be confusing, how are we going to fit in all that geometry? And it's further complicated when you have different ethnicities of character. So for example, with an Asian character, how do we sort of manage that kind of topology? So as I was mentioning, when it really matters for cinematics, for AAA, for example, we just do have more geometry to play with. So the animator can come in here and they have many, many loops to choose from, and then they can just open and close these as they please with weighting. Sometimes we do use advanced blend shapes, but it depends on the project, depends on the size of the animation team example, but the standard is just normal weight painting with some kind of bone system where the eyes close and the geometry follows. So guys, what that means on your projects, I've got a live game character here. So there's lots of different components to the eyes, which I'll get through in a video later. There is a series coming out on the eye to actually create the eyeball itself. So we can see that we've got the inner eye, the outer eye, and some other components like the water lines. Now, if I just move all this geometry out the way so you can see what sort of eyelid we're working with, we look at this. This is an Asian character as well, so there's not too much surface area to put those loops in. And what we've got here is about 2 loops that are going to be used for the blink. And that should be enough geometry on this side to basically complete that full turn. So if you think about it, the eyelid isn't actually moving that far into the midpoint. It's only a couple of centimeters. So we only need 1 or 2 loops to actually close this eye. And if you imagine it from a game's perspective, with this eye, this will be the outside of the eye, and this is the closed state, maybe just slightly lower, sort of around here. But if we draw the points in here, we can actually see how much geometry we need. So really only about 3 loops to complete that project. So it's a funny one because when you think about it, it sounds very complex. But when you break it down to how it actually works within the game, very, very simple, just not too much geometry. Now, there can be examples where you just want some more fidelity, and it's totally okay to come in here and put loops in that are very, very close together. I mean, if you just really need that animation, so say, for example, like the eyes are coming out and stretching, or if we make a tongue that needs to come out and stretch really far, we do just pack all the geometry really, really close. And for whatever reason, people get a little bit scared of putting verts too close to each other. It's totally okay, because when it comes to animation, we select those verts, give them different levels of weight painting to a bone, and then they stretch out and it's completely fine. So as long as you've got enough geometry in there that you've inserted manually, if when in doubt, I always say put in additional loops. No one's going to shout at you too much for adding too many loops. I've definitely not shouted, but I've definitely complained to people about not having enough loops around certain facial animation features or joints and things like that. So I would err on about 3 or 4 loops. So next question is from Sky Neezy. So they're new here. So welcome to the 3D Mutiny. Welcome to the Discord. It's nice to have you here. So there's a good couple of questions here, and they touch on very important aspects of games, which is obtaining frame rates with your LODs, and also another question when it comes to cloth folds and how extreme curvature is handled with polygon counts. For example, rolled up sleeves, that's very complicated. There's lots of high poly geometry there. How do we actually make that into a low poly? And then also finally nails. Are they going to be a separate mesh, or are they going to be combined together? So can definitely cover all those questions. LODs are an interesting one. They're also an afterthought for many character artists. So I only really started to purely understand the workflows and the technology for LODs when I became an art director, because then we had to actually start thinking about, how many LODs there are going to be, what reduction rate they're going to happen at. So if you're new to LODs, in a basic sense, what we do is we make reduced versions in terms of triangle counts of a character or a barrel or a prop or anything like that. It's mainly in environments, to be honest. And they don't have to be too optimized unless it's a character. We do still want to keep a couple of animation loops and things like that, but mostly they're going to be comprised of triangles. And most often they're generated by some sort of software. Only with characters in specific examples would we actually want someone to create a low poly version of it. But nowadays, it's starting to change. So, in that question, you're asking about modern games engines, emerging techniques, and the automated process. Should artists retop by hand? And it's a good question because it's confusing. The technology is changing and we are going through a transformation. So I sort of I'll tell you how it's going on right nowadays. So back a couple of years ago in games, which is actually quite a long time in terms of games years, we used to have to physically make lower level detailed versions of a character because we can only present so many polygons on the screen at one time, especially for the GPU. But as you and I know, the GPUs are getting very, very strong now. So LODs are becoming a little bit nondescript. And especially with new technologies like nanite, it can get a little bit confusing. So I'll try and guide you through that. So for those that are really unfamiliar with it, with LODs, what we do is when something has a greater distance, we tend to put less detail into that. And that saves us on resources. For a majority of games across the board, if you look over the last 10 years, or even maybe even further, the prevailing software used to be Simplygon. So do this next time you play a game, look at the end credits, you'll probably see Simplygon, speed tree. These are really, really commonly used. And what we would do is we'd chuck a character into that, and then it would automate the LODs. So for example, here you can see how it's triangulated, very similar to how you would see it with ZBrush when you decimate something. And this actually used to be quite a problem. You had to pay for Simplygon later, and we'd always have problems. We'd have to like contact their support and try and fix some certain things. Within engine updates, something would always go wrong. They tried to reintegrate it into Unreal Engine, and then at some point Unreal Engine basically took over. I think they actually bought the system state for it. So that what that means on your guys' projects is that whenever you bring in a character into Unreal Engine, you want to look into the detail sections, and there will be options for LODs. And these are all automated, and they're automated inside of Unreal Engine. So you click a button, you choose a percentage triangle rate. So say, for example, you've got a 100K character. The first LOD, you might go for 50%, for example, and then choose sort of what distance that starts to kick in. But this can all be done inside the details. So games is getting really nice and fluid now in terms of the workflows. You don't have to keep on jumping around to different softwares. Now, on your question of future technologies, um, obviously it's hard to say because I can't predict the future of what the technologies are coming out. No one can. But I predict we're going to be sort of heading towards the nanite area. And if they can get the software out, nanite in combination with weight painting. So if you're a character artist, nanite isn't going to be so interesting for you right now. It's mainly for CG and environmental design. Even in games, we don't really like to use it too much because there's just so much data and information there. Without waffling on too much, is like you imagine the size and how many gigabytes your game is going to be. If that's comprised of nanite, that's going to be very, very big. So nanite's more reserved for curvature, but around the corner, I will be seeing that LODs we're not even going to have to think twice about in every single example. So on your question, I wouldn't worry about it too much, especially for you learning how to do LODs. But it's always a good idea to understand how to reduce a model manually, because retopology is going to be around for a very long time. Even with the AI and stuff, it's not going to be able to do it. So next on your question of how to avoid, or should you avoid big cloth folds since their extreme curvature increases the polygon count. For example, rolled up sleeves in Marvelous Designer. So it's a good question. Obviously, when you have a very broad and wide piece of geometry, as we were looking with the eye, you have to have a certain amount of vertices to cover that curvature. So say you had a very big cape, for example, we would want a lot of geometry, but with rolled up sleeves, you do have to remember that that's probably going to be condensed in a very small space. And because it's going to be so small, we're not going to be able to see it on screen, and therefore we don't need too much geometry for it. So that's how I would think about topology and density. So don't try and think about it on trying to match your simulation perfectly, for example. So say, for example, if we took this into a games engine, obviously this curve is very fine and delicate. But with the low poly, we'd only use a couple of verts for that. And then the normal map's going to do all the work. Same with the pillowcase, for example, we've got curvature here. And upon your question, we'd have to put some additional verts to cover that, and then the budget's going to go up. But for games, we would just go over that and let the normal map do it all together. So I'll show you a practical example inside of ZBrush. So this is a character with a rolled up sleeve, not fully rolled up, but we've got some particular layers and levels to it. Now, I suggest, and what we do as game characters, we don't really want to have what's called rat's nests inside of a sculpt. So these are kind of like cavity pockets within the mesh. So always what I want to do when I'm making some cloth folds is actually close them down in anticipation that we're going to retopologize it. So if you look at this asset here, for those who are in the retopology stage now, you can probably see that and be confident that you can retop that quite nicely without too many errors. But when we simulate that out of Marvelous Designer, it might come all very complicated and curved up. So your role as a game artist is basically to clean it up. So it's just something easier to manage with. And that'll be important for later down the workflow when it comes to animations, texturing, UVs, the whole thing. So back to your question, if you're going to be avoiding the big thick cloth, I would say only avoid it if it's not important. If it's a big feature to your character like a cape, then obviously we do want to put a lot of curvature in there. If it's a small feature that can be obtained by a normal map, really easy to retopologize, then don't do it. Also, a secondary to that is nowadays in games, we don't really care too much about polygon budgets. We care about optimizations and being efficient, but we can actually throw a lot of geometry at the model and it will be completely fine. So I wouldn't worry about it when you're creating your characters. Additional bit of advice as well, whenever you're doing retopology or creating sort of like cloth folds, it's always easier to work back with a model. So say, for example, you've got big cloth folds, and as long as they're in sort of like quads and efficient, we can always come back and reduce the amount of fold geometry in there. Whereas it's actually harder to add a geometry. So always try and err on the side of lots of geometry that follows the silhouette of the cloth or your fold. And then we can take it back after if there's like an art review or an optimization review. Okay, so now onto your question about the nails. So multiple ways of approaching it. I would say there's like a perfected way and a very simple way, and it will change depending on what your targets are. So I believe there's another video of me going through how to basically sculpt the hand. I can't remember if I do go through the nails, but I'll go through it in more details here. So if it's just something you're sculpting, trying to get the feel of, then I would have it all as one combined mesh. So what you'd basically be doing is coming in and sculpting the nails, maybe using something like a polish. Now, when it comes to the final character and you're happy with the scale of the nail and how it looks and how the fingers feel, it might be an idea to then convert that into a separate floating piece of geometry. So if you look on these assets, these are actually different subtools. Now, the added benefit of that is we can actually increase the subdivs or the subdivisions and the quality of the nail without having to up the resolution of the entire asset. Because then if we did that, our computers would basically crash. The added benefit as well, we can also have a separate nail mesh off to the side, and then we can use that, put loads of detail into it, maybe some nooks and crannies, maybe even paint it, and then we can start to use that on different projects. So you'd have that in your library as a characterized. And actually, something that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be sending out these useful resources, things like nails and eyelashes, to people on the email list. So if you're not on the email list, just look somewhere down there. There's a place to tell me where to send all that sort of stuff on your emails. And the benefits, to be honest, they keep on coming with separating the nail off as well. Once they are separated and it comes to baking onto one single low poly mesh, you get the option that you now have a separate nail ID. And so we can do loads of different things with this. We can change the shader parameters. So maybe it's like taking away some subsurface scattering, and it would be pixel perfect, identical to the mesh and the high poly. So it's just an increased level of accuracy and autonomy to separate all that off. Even more benefits, to be honest, is like once you've got that nail seated on the character, we can start to fold all the skin on top of it. So we can sort out how the transition of that nail is going back into the hand. And it just offers you loads of additional options. So I wouldn't dive for you guys, I wouldn't dive straight into putting a separate nail, because if you're in the concepting stage or the block out phase, or you're going through another level of review with your art team or your art director, you do want to have it at an easy adjustable stage. And it's just as easy to just come in and like sculpt that on the main mesh very quickly. Like a nice little trick that I like to do is if you come in and hold the mask, I'm going to do this really rough. You can paint the shape of a nail, then you can get that mask and then invert it, come to your move gizmo. And then if you alt click on somewhere around there on the nail, here's like a really neat trick that I've learned. So approach it from the side. And what I do is I rotate it up slightly. And the sharper the mask, the sharper the nail. So you want to make this sharp really. So to sharpen that, you can either just come in and continuously keep on painting over it. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this one. So you can come to the masking section over here. You can shrink or grow the mask or sharpen it or boost it. There's loads of different options here. What I prefer to do is a lot faster, is hold Control and Alt and then tap on the mask itself. And then that inherently sharpens it. So once we've got the inversion and a nice sharp little mask, come from the side, rotate it like this one. And then we get the move tool and just pull it out and up depending on where your geometry is. And that creates a nice little nail flick, and then you can come under here and refine it. That's all you have to do in the main sculpt. And then later, what you can then come and do, like I've done with the undersides here, is insert a floating piece of geometry for the nail and then just track it all back with something like a clay tube. And again, without getting too carried away, you can use the H polish just to clean up these areas, use soften, and then just design that nail how you want to before you replace it. So next question is from Glut, asking what the workflows they should keep an eye on and implement in the toolbox, and also what are the most common outdated techniques that I see, even though there are better ways to go about it. So that's an interesting question. Obviously, there's a bit of sort of like future prediction in there, so I'll try and be as accurate as I can with that. The outdated techniques are the common ones I see on the internet, and sometimes I see students slip into bad habits. Maybe they see a YouTube video that's like not the way to do something. There's a lot of misinformation out there in terms of tutorials and stuff. So I'll try and think about the top ones off the top of my head. The workflows to keep an eye on and where basically the industry is moving is more in a focus on keeping in one sort of software, whether that's going to be ZBrush or Unreal Engine, for example. So you'll probably see a lot of consolidation of software. That's just usually where technology goes. So if you can pick the best and biggest racehorse and stick with that, I think you'd be well on your way with correct workflows. That's what you should be keeping your eye on. The kind of workflows to avoid, my prediction, it hasn't really happened yet. It might be coming out with the newest GTAs, but I believe we're going to be coming away from hair strand and hair card rendering. We haven't solved the technology just yet, and it doesn't look that good. Still, hair cards are completely dominating the industry, but the natural progression is we want to be getting away from these things. And because we don't really use hair cards in CG, we can predict that it's not going to be used in games. So those are the sort of workflows I would try and steer clear of. Very difficult one. I still think it's very important to understand how to make hair cards. But now what we're going to be seeing is a lot of pre-made hair simulations and things like that. So I wouldn't put all your chips on being a hair artist. Let's put it like that. Try and be a bit more of a generalized artist who can do hair cards. And it's going to be the same for fur. In terms of your question on outdated techniques, I don't know if there's any outdated techniques. There's obviously really unoptimal ways to go about making something that maybe was used about 10 years ago. So, for example, with videos coming out on how to make the eye, for example, we used to use a lot of things like parallaxing on characters. So I go over that in the video, whereas now we're starting to focus more on ray tracing and physical accuracy of an asset. So basically creating things how they're actually made in real life and then letting the games engine do all the work. So I think what you're going to be finding is with games technology, we're going to have fewer and fewer tricks. Obviously, we covered a little bit about exploding a mesh. That used to be a legacy way of doing baking. And there's still loads of information on YouTube on how to do that, but it is actually a really outdated workflow. In Substance, we obviously have match by mesh name where we don't have to do that exploding and we do get local ambient occlusion. So there's little areas like that. And to be honest, every stone you uncover in high poly, low poly unwrapping, there's going to be some kind of outdated workflow. My general suggestion to you is just look in the places where the most current information is. And that's usually people tied to active industry. You don't want people sort of like legacy and still have their old sort of workflows. So anyone who's actively doing things is going to be a really good source for the games industry stuff. And in terms of your outdated techniques and better ways to go about, if I had to really pick one, I would pick the whole XGen route. So I've spent so many hours learning XGen. I've used it on many characters. We do use it for high quality, but also at the same time, I can say that there are slightly quicker ways to do it, whether it's doing inside of ZBrush and creating the strands like we've done on previous videos, or just using third-party software like Fibershop. So I think those sort of workflows are becoming outdated now that we're starting to see more game characters, now that we're starting to see more avatars come into the industry. And as a final sort of wrap up for everyone, in terms of where the industry is heading regarding performance solutions, but it'd be interesting to see your take on it. So I've been saying this for very long time, for multiple years, is start to not think about games technology as just being games. We're now really starting to call it real-time technologies, and we'll be blurring the lines between games and real-time CG. These are going to become much of the same thing. It's already happening with CG coming into Unreal Engine. So you as an artist, instead of being we call it a games artist, it's very convenient. It sounds a little bit better than real time. But for your future jobs and what you'll be focusing on, you're going to have more job opportunities as a real time artist. And I think a lot of movie creators and people who work with high fidelity, like UDIMs, they're all going to come into this real time space because it's just better across the board. Art directors can see things live action instead of having to render it all out. And the technology is just getting more powerful with the amount of GPU computations. It's getting so powerful. You'll see a reduction in all these sort of like games tricks that we have to do. In a couple of years, I don't know how it's going to happen, but eventually I believe retopology will be a thing of the past. I think we're so far away from it, but in a general sense, when something's annoying in some kind of workflow, all the technology finds a way of ironing it out. So usually people don't like retopology, they don't like hair cards. There will be solutions for that in the future.